I fear not the dark itself, but what may lurk within it. Welcome to Lurk, bringing you creepy, strange, and bone-chilling stories, with your host, Jamie Jackson.
Hey Lurkers, welcome to this week's episode. Tonight we are heading out onto the Chesapeake Bay again to a place where the water seems to hold on to the past. We're headed to a small island on the Chesapeake called Tangier Island. Tangier Island sits roughly 12 miles off the coast of Virginia, surrounded by miles of open water and separated from the mainland by one of the Chesapeake's most unforgiving stretches of bay. There are no bridges connecting Tangier to the mainland, no highways leading onto the island. For generations, the people who have called Tangier home have depended on the water for almost everything. And that means they've also learned to live with the storms, fog, shipwrecks, and dangers that come with it. But isolation has another effect. It gives stories a long time to take root. And on Tangier Island, there are plenty of stories. There are stories of communities that disappeared beneath the Chesapeake, graves that have been exposed by the relentless erosion of the island, old houses with unsettling histories, and watermen who went out onto the bay and never came home. Some of these stories have been passed down by island families for generations. Others were recorded by researchers who spent time living among the people of Tangier. And some are stories that seem to exist somewhere between history and legend, where the details have been passed from one generation to the next, until no one can say for certain where the truth ends and the folklore begins. But perhaps the strangest thing about Tangier isn't what people say they've seen there. It's what's slowly disappearing. Beneath the water surrounding the island are the remains of communities that once stood where there is now only marsh and open water. Old cemeteries have been disturbed by erosion, sometimes exposing the remains of people who were buried there generations ago. Even the remnants of an ancient forest can still be found beneath the waters of the Chesapeake. On Tangier, the past isn't simply remembered. Sometimes, the bay gives it back. Tonight we're setting out across the Chesapeake to explore the history, legends, maritime lore, and ghost stories of one of Virginia's most isolated communities. So dim the lights, hop in your dinghy, and let's get lurking. And yes, absolutely, I find every opportunity to use the word dinghy, in case you're wondering. Our journey begins out in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay, on a small island where the shoreline is disappearing, the past is never very far away, and sometimes the dead don't stay buried. Welcome to Tangier Island. There are places where the dead are separated from the living. There's a cemetery at the edge of town, a churchyard behind an iron fence, or perhaps a quiet piece of ground where generations of families have been laid to rest. And then there are places where the dead are never very far away. Tangier Island is one of those places. Out in the Chesapeake Bay, approximately 12 miles from the Virginia mainland, Tangier is a place that can feel almost impossibly isolated from the rest of the world. There's no bridge, no highway, there's only water. Even today, you reach Tangier by boat or by plane, and when you arrive, you're entering a community whose history has been shaped by that isolation for generations. The National Park Service describes Tangier as a small island community with roots reaching back centuries, where descendants of some of the earliest European settlers still live today. But Tangier is more than an isolated island. It's a place where the past is disappearing beneath the Chesapeake. Communities that once stood on the island are gone. Graves have been exposed by erosion. Old objects wash up along beaches where houses once stood. And beneath the water are the remains of a landscape that was once occupied by people who lived, worked, prayed, raised children, and died there. It's not difficult to understand how a place like this develops ghost stories. For generations, Tangier's watermen have spent their lives on the Chesapeake Bay. But long before Tangier became the home of watermen and crabbers, the island was part of a much older story. Native peoples had been using the islands of the Chesapeake for centuries before Europeans arrived. Archaeological evidence, including stone points and shell middens, show that indigenous people harvested the rich resources of the Chesapeake long before European settlement. Then, in 1608, Captain John Smith and his crew encountered the islands during their exploration of the Chesapeake. Smith called them the Russell Isles, after Dr. Walter Russell, one of the men traveling with him. European settlement came later. The National Park Service records a tradition that in 1707 a man named Post obtained the islands and brought 3 families and livestock from England to establish settlements there. Over time, the descendants of those families became the core of Tangier's population. For generations, the islanders were primarily farmers, but the Chesapeake was always there, and eventually the water became more important than the land. Fishing became a major source of income. Then came oysters, then crabs. The people of Tangier became watermen, and the skills necessary to survive on the bay were passed from generation to generation. A Tangier waterman didn't simply learn how to operate a boat. He learned the water itself. He learned the channels, the currents, the weather, and he learned which sounds mattered. That knowledge was essential because the Chesapeake could be beautiful one minute and deadly the next. A calm morning could become a dangerous afternoon. Fog could erase the shoreline, ice could trap boats and damage structures. A storm could alter the shape of an island, and sometimes the bay simply just took someone. There was no body or explanation. There was only the knowledge that someone had gone out and never returned. That kind of life creates stories. One of the most unusual things about Tangier is the relationship between the living and the dead. The island has very little high ground. As a result, families historically buried their dead in small family burial grounds close to their homes. In some cases, graves were located in what an outsider would consider the front yard. The National Park Service has documented this practice and explained that Tangier's lack of suitable high ground made traditional large cemeteries difficult. That means that on Tangier, death has never been completely separated from everyday life. A family could look out its kitchen window and see the graves of relatives. Children could grow up knowing the names of the people buried nearby. A fisherman might walk past the grave of someone who had once worked beside him. The dead were not somewhere far away. They were part of the landscape, and the landscape itself was changing. In the northern part of Tangier, there were once communities collectively associated with an area known as the Uppards. One of those communities was Canaan. There were also settlements associated with Reubentown and Persimmon Ridge. A Virginia Department of Historic Resources archaeological survey found evidence of those former communities, including artifacts, a brick-lined well, and the remains of the Uppard Cemetery. By 1942, maps showed none of these settlements that had appeared on the 1917 map. The people left, communities disappeared, and eventually the land itself began to disappear. That's where Tangier's history begins to sound like a ghost story, because the places that vanished did not simply become abandoned. The Chesapeake took them back. Imagine standing on Tangier Island generations ago and looking north. You would have seen more land than exists there today. You would have seen houses, roads, people, and communities. You might have seen children playing. You might have seen boats coming and going. And somewhere nearby would have been the graves of people who had already lived and died there. Now imagine returning years later. The house is gone, the road is gone, the community's gone, and eventually, the graveyard's gone too. The Virginia Department of Historic Resources has documented that the former community of Canaan is now represented primarily by the old cemetery and a brick-lined well, with artifacts from the former settlement appearing along the beach. And erosion continues to expose the island's past. A 2018 report about Tangier described a gravestone lying on the beach at Uppards. The stone had once stood in the cemetery at Canaan, a community that's now underwater. Think about that. A gravestone sitting on a beach. The person buried beneath it was once part of a living community. Someone knew that person, someone loved that person. Someone carried their body to the cemetery and placed a stone over their grave. Then the land disappeared. The grave was exposed, and eventually the stone itself ended up on the beach. There is something profoundly unsettling about that, because the dead are supposed to remain where we put them. But on Tangier, sometimes the bay changes the rules. S. Warren Hall III saw evidence of the disappearing landscape when he conducted his study of Tangier in the 1930s. Hall's book, Tangier Island, A Study of an Isolated Group, was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 1939. I'd say that I would tag it in the show notes. However, you can only find the book in used online bookstores. Also, not very riveting, so I'll spare you. Hall conducted an ethnographic study of the island, spending extended time there and interviewing residents about their history, customs, religion, work, and family life. And Hall documented something that sounds almost impossible. He described the remains of an old pine forest beneath the water. Tangier had once been much more heavily wooded, but by Hall's time, the bay had claimed much of that landscape, though submerged tree stumps could still be seen beneath the water. Old residents remembered the forest. The living could look into the Chesapeake and see the remains of a landscape that had existed before them. That image is important, because Tangier doesn't just have stories about ghosts. Tangier has physical evidence of a vanished world. The dead landscape is still visible. The old communities are still represented by artifacts. The graves occasionally reappear, and sometimes the water gives back pieces of what it took. That makes the folklore of Tangier different from a ghost story attached to an old house. The island itself is haunted by its own history. Tangier has always been a deeply religious community, and one of the most important figures in its history was a Methodist minister named Joshua Thomas. Thomas became known as the parson of the islands. He was not simply a preacher who stayed inside one church. He traveled among the islands by boat. According to Hall's account, Thomas used a canoe called the Methodist to travel between Tangier and the other islands, carrying preachers and conducting religious work among isolated communities. By the time Hall studied Tangier, Joshua Thomas had become almost a legendary figure. People still pointed out places associated with him. They remembered where he preached, they remembered where he anchored, and they remembered the story of his prediction during the War of 1812. In 1814, the British occupied Tangier and built Fort Albion. The island became a major British military base in the Chesapeake. It was strategically located for operations against Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, and the British used it as a staging area for their campaigns. But Fort Albion was also something else. It became a place where enslaved African Americans escaping from the surrounding mainland could reach British protection. The British eventually trained approximately 200 black men from the Chesapeake as the Colonial Corps of Marines on Tangier Island. These men fought alongside British forces during the campaigns of 1814. For the people who escaped slavery, Tangier wasn't simply a military base. It could be the place where they first became free. That makes the island's War of 1812 history much more complicated and much more powerful than the usual story about the British burning Washington. And then there was Joshua Thomas. As the British prepared to attack Baltimore, Thomas reportedly warned them that they would fail. According to the National Park Service, Thomas told the British that their expedition would make widows and orphans, but they would not take Baltimore. Then away the British went. They attacked Baltimore, and they failed. Quick aside, my 4 times great-grandfather was one of the valiant defenders of Baltimore, according to his obituary, in 1814, and I actually have his wife's handkerchief, in case you're wondering. A little plug for genealogy. If you do genealogy, suddenly history becomes way more fascinating than just sitting in school and learning about it. because you become part of it. Just saying. I know I'm a nerd. I don't apologize for that fact. Anyway, this story became part of Tangier's identity. Whether Thomas was simply making a prediction, expressing a religious conviction, or believed he had received some kind of divine warning, we really can't know. But his story created an interesting tradition. On Tangier, warnings before disaster became part of the island's folklore. And one particular warning would eventually become one of the strangest legends. There is a story associated with Tangier Island that sounds like it came from a ghost story, but it was apparently important enough to survive in the memories of island residents that it was later recalled by someone who said they had lived on Tangier and remembered reading about it in Hall's book. The story concerns something called the striker. The striker was said to be a fast-moving blue light. According to the recollection, the light was associated with major events in the island's history. It was said to have appeared before the British occupation during the War of 1812. It was associated with a major hurricane, a cholera outbreak, and it was said to have appeared before the influenza pandemic of 1918. And then the story gets much stranger, because the striker wasn't always seen from a distance. One of the stories associated with the striker concerns a place called Wheeler's Hole. Wheeler's Hole was one of those small communities that once existed among the islands of the Chesapeake. Today, the place is gone. According to the account, a boy living there encountered the striker. The light supposedly came close to him, so close in fact that the boy later had burn marks on his head and hands. It was said that the light somehow told him where to find gold coins, and, oddly, the boy actually found the coins. And later, according to the story, the boy suffered serious mental problems, but we really can't say if the striker was the cause of those or not. If you want to understand how closely death has always been woven into the life on Tangier, there is a much more recent story that doesn't involve a ghost at all. It involves a house. The house is known as the Doctor's House. In 2017, anthropologist Jonna Yarrington moved to Tangier for 13 months of ethnographic fieldwork. She lived in the old doctor's house, and while she was there, one of the island residents told her something about the house's history. According to the resident, the porch had once been used to store bodies when the ground was too wet or frozen for burials. The resident then added something that caught Yarrington's attention. They said the house was probably haunted. This account appears in Yarrington's 2026 article in Medical Anthropology Quarterly, which examines Tangier's experience of environmental change and the emotional consequences of living on an island that is disappearing. I find the story particularly interesting because it isn't a paranormal investigation. The person telling Yarrington about the house wasn't trying to prove anything. They were explaining the history of the building. Bodies had supposedly been stored there because the island's ground made burial difficult. And somewhere along the way, the practical history of the building became associated with the possibility that the dead had never completely left. That's how folklore works. It doesn't always begin with a ghost. Sometimes it begins with something that actually happened. Tangier has another story that's even stranger. It's pretty weird. Ed Econowitz, a writer and folklorist who has collected legends from Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, and the Chesapeake region, included a Tangier Island story in his book, Opening the Door, Mid-Atlantic Ghost Stories. The book's description specifically identifies one of its stories as involving a spirited serpent on Tangier Island. It's not a very long story, so I'll share it to you now as it was told to the author. My friend Sarah told me a story about events that occurred at the home of her brother, Harold, and her sister-in-law, Betty, not their actual names, who lived on Tangier Island, an isolated portion of Virginia in the Chesapeake Bay. Since the couple claims its home is built on an Indian burial ground, unusual activity at their residence occurs a bit more frequently than at other sites on the island and on the mainland. The first ghost they saw wasn't a good ghost, Sarah said. And believe me, they have seen plenty. All the other ghosts were good and just liked to tease you, they told me, but the first one was the worst. Sarah said Harold and Betty had fallen asleep one evening while watching television. He was snoozing in a lounge chair, and she was sleeping on a sofa located on the other side of the room. When Harold woke up, Sarah said, he had left his chair and was standing over his wife, choking her, and she was making gurgling sounds. He couldn't believe he was doing this. Betty pointed to his chest, and then he looked down and saw a large black and white snake, about 6 feet long, wrapped around him. He took his hands off Betty and got a hold of the snake, and Betty ran into the other room and got out the Bible. By the time Betty returned to the living room and started to read passages from the Bible, the snake began to leave her husband's body. As it slithered across the floor and headed into the kitchen, Betty continued to read holy verses aloud, and the couple followed behind the serpent. They followed the snake from the living room to the kitchen, Sarah said. When the snake got to the back door, it disappeared like a puff of smoke. That was more than 3 years ago. They have been afraid to tell anyone, and the two of them didn't speak a word about it until they visited me at my place. And they haven't seen the snake again since that night, but they have a copy of the Bible in every room, in case it were to happen again. Tangier's supernatural atmosphere isn't entirely dependent on folklore. Sometimes the history is disturbing enough by itself. South of Tangier Island once stood Tangier Sound Light. The lighthouse was built in 1890 to mark a dangerous shoal at the entrance to Tangier Sound. It was a square, screw-pile lighthouse standing 45 feet above the water. Its light flashed white every 6 seconds, with a red sector marking dangerous shoals. And it had a fog bell. 1 bell, a blow, 10 seconds of silence, another blow, 10 seconds of silence. Imagine hearing that in the darkness, over and over, a warning moving across the water. The lighthouse stood in an exposed position, and in 1905 something remarkable happened. Ice caused the wreck of a sunken schooner to rise and collide with the lighthouse. The structure survived, but 9 years later the station experienced a tragedy. On February 11, 1914, assistant keeper Captain William Asbury Crockett left home after visiting his family and set sail back to the lighthouse. Unfortunately, the weather turned quickly, and a bad northwester storm moved in. Keeper Edward L. Thomas watched through the lighthouse window as Crockett made progress across the sound and could see the winds were getting worse. Crockett was within a half-mile of the lighthouse when he was hit in the head by the wooden boom and knocked overboard. Keeper Thomas lowered the lighthouse boat into the water and tried to get to Crockett in time. Unfortunately, by the time Keeper Thomas got there, it was too late. Captain Crockett was already dead. Keeper Thomas was cited for his bravery a year later. There is no verified ghost story attached to the man's death, as the lighthouse was dismantled in 1961. But imagine spending a night alone at that station after the accident. Imagine hearing the fog bell. Imagine looking into the darkness and knowing that someone who worked beside you was somewhere beneath the water. Quick shameless plug, you can listen to Tales of the Haunted Chesapeake Lighthouses in the Lurk 2-part series, episode 177 and 178, The Haunted Lighthouses of the Chesapeake Bay. The Chesapeake has always had its own maritime folklore. Some of it came from European sailors, some of it developed among American watermen, and some of it probably came from the simple fact that people working on the water encounter things they cannot immediately explain, like the ghost ship seen around Tangier Island. The ghost ship's origins can be traced back to at least 1845, though stories of strange lights and mysterious vessels continue to surface into the present day. The earliest known sighting took place on December 23, 1845, when John Moore reported seeing a ship with red lanterns and white sails hovering near the island. This first account was documented by local historian Albert MacArthur in his book Tangier Island, 1960. In 1883, a local fisherman reported seeing a ship with no visible crew and strange lights coming from its deck. The ship was about 150 feet long, with 2 masts and white sails. The fisherman claimed to have seen it several times over the next few months, but never managed to get close enough for identification. During World War II, there were reports of a ship with red lights circling the island at night. Local fishermen reported seeing this vessel on multiple occasions, leading some to believe that it might be a German U-boat, or perhaps a civilian craft used by the military for patrol duties. The most notable sighting occurred on March 23, 1987, when two local residents, Sarah Thompson and her husband John, were fishing in the bay late at night. They claimed to have seen a ship with bright red lights accompanied by eerie white flashes of light every few seconds. The ship appeared to be in distress, with its hull aglow, but no visible crew or occupants. Sarah described it as a huge vessel much larger than any commercial boat I've ever seen. John added, "The lights were like nothing we'd ever seen before, bright and pulsing, almost rhythmic." Later that night, the Thompsons reported their sighting to a local Coast Guard station. However, no other ships or aircraft were sighted in the vicinity, leading some to speculate that the phenomena might be related to unexplained atmospheric conditions. In 2015, two students from the University of Maryland conducted a survey of the area and recorded several strange light patterns using night vision equipment. They reported seeing brief flashes of red and white lights, but did not report any other vessels or objects in the vicinity. Several investigations have been carried out over the years to try and uncover the truth behind the ghost ship sightings, though none have provided any definitive answers. In 1998, the Tangier Island Historical Society organized a nighttime expedition with members of the U.S. Coast Guard and local fishermen. The group conducted visual and audio scans of the area, but failed to locate any unusual activity. More recently, in 2021, an independent paranormal investigation team from the Ghost Hunters International Network visited Tangier Island for several nights. Using thermal imaging cameras and night vision devices, they captured several unexplained light patterns that did not correspond to known ships or aircraft. However, these were attributed more to atmospheric phenomena rather than a ghost ship. Despite the numerous sightings and investigations, the mystery of the Tangier Island ghost ship remains unsolved. Local residents continue to report strange lights and unexplained occurrences in the waters around their island home. Some attribute these phenomena to uncharted underwater formations or atmospheric mirages, while others believe it could be a ghostly vessel from the past. Imagine being out on the bay before sunrise and you can't see the shoreline. You hear something behind you and you turn, but there's nothing there. Then you hear it again. A voice, a bell, an engine. You look toward the sound and you see a light moving through the fog. For someone who has grown up hearing about the striker, about drowned communities, about people who vanished in storms, the experience doesn't exist in isolation. It connects to everything they have been told since childhood. There may be no better symbol for Tangier's relationship with its dead than the old cemetery at Canaan. The community disappeared, but the cemetery remained, for a while. Eventually, erosion began exposing the graves. In recent decades, visitors and residents have found gravestones on the beach and human remains emerging from the soil. One account describes the discovery of a skeleton exposed in the area of the former Canaan cemetery. The person had been buried there generations earlier. The coffin had long since deteriorated. The earth had eroded, and the bay had exposed the remains. There's something deeply unsettling about the image. A human skeleton lying in the place where a house once stood. Not because a ghost was standing there, but because the dead person was supposed to remain hidden beneath the ground. The landscape changed, the ground could not keep up, and the bay revealed what the community had tried to protect. This is one of the reasons I think Tangier is more interesting than a conventional haunted location. The haunting isn't confined to a building, it's happening to the landscape itself. Tangier has lost enormous amounts of land. Communities that appear on historic maps have disappeared. The northern portion, known as the Upwards, is now largely marsh and wetland. The old community of Canaan survives primarily through archaeological remains and the cemetery. And that's where the folklore becomes difficult to separate from reality. Because when people tell stories about hearing something across the water, there really were communities there. When people talk about old graves, the graves really exist. When they talk about houses disappearing, the houses really did disappear. And when they talk about strange objects appearing on the shoreline, there really are artifacts emerging from places that used to be occupied. And when they talk about the island disappearing, it really is. Tangier isn't simply a place where people tell stories about a lost world. It's a place where the lost world is physically beneath their feet. Today, the story of Tangier is increasingly a story about survival. The island continues to lose land. Storms alter its shoreline. Erosion threatens the places where people live. And the people who call Tangier home know that the island they inherited may not look the same for their grandchildren. That creates a strange relationship with time. The past is disappearing, the present is changing, and the future is uncertain. Imagine yourself crossing Tangier Sound at night. The boat is moving slowly. The water is almost completely black. There is only the sound of the engine, the wind, and the water against the hull. Then the fog comes. The shoreline disappears. You can't see the houses anymore. You can't see the docks. You can't see the island. And somewhere in the darkness you see a light. It's moving. For a moment you can't tell how far away it is. You watch it and you remember the story. The striker, the blue light, the warning. Maybe you tell yourself that it's simply another boat. Maybe it is. But then you think about everything beneath the water. The old communities, the old roads, the old houses, the old cemeteries, the pine trees described beneath the Chesapeake. The people who once lived on that land that no longer exists. And you realize that if Tangier has ghosts, they don't necessarily need to appear in front of you. They're already all around you. The Chesapeake is constantly changing. It takes land, it uncovers graves, it moves shorelines, it destroys buildings, it erases communities. But there's one thing the water hasn't been able to take: the stories. So maybe Tangier isn't haunted because the dead refuse to leave. Maybe Tangier is haunted because the living refuse to let them disappear. Somewhere beyond the fog, a light moves across the water. Maybe it's a boat, maybe it's a reflection. Maybe it's something we haven't found an explanation for yet. Or maybe it's the striker. So as the sun sets over Tangier Island and the last light disappears across the Chesapeake, the stories of this little island seem to linger just a little longer. Maybe it's the voices carried across the water, the footsteps heard where no one should be walking, or the feeling that something is watching from the darkness beyond the marsh. Whatever it is, Tangier Island has a way of reminding us that some places hold on to their history, and sometimes that history doesn't want to stay buried. If you've ever visited Tangier Island, or if you've had your own strange or unexplained experience anywhere along the Chesapeake, I'd love to hear from you. You can share your story with me at lurkpodcast@yahoo.com, and your experience could become part of a future episode of Lurk. If you've enjoyed this episode, don't forget to follow Lurk so you never miss another journey into the strange, the unexplained, and the things that lurk just beyond what we can see. Also, please consider giving us a 5-star review, and make sure you tell your friends to listen. You can find Lurk on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, YouTube, and wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also find all of our episodes along with additional stories, articles, and information at lurkpodcast.com. Until next time, Lurkers, listen closely when the water goes still. Keep an eye on the fog as it rolls across the marsh. And if you ever find yourself alone on Tangier Island after dark, remember, not everything you hear coming across the water belongs to the living. And as always, keep lurking.